Hi friends, today I want to share with you the books I read in February, and I don't want to make this into 2 videos, so let's get started and keep it short. The first book that I read in February was Yes Please by Amy Poehler. I really enjoyed this book. It was a carryover from my January kick where I was reading a lot of celebrity female memoirs, and it was exactly what I expected. It was a bit about Amy Poehler's childhood, her career trajectory, overlapping with other celebrities, which was kind of fun. Bits about projects that she's been involved with that I really enjoyed, like Parks and Rec, and all of that sprinkled with a bit of humor the entire way. I really enjoyed it. It was what I expected. As a recommendation, I did listen to the audiobook of this book, and I would absolutely recommend that because first off, just any memoir just adds a new level to have the author read it, I think. But in particular for this book, there's a chapter in the book written by Seth Meyers, and then the audiobook is read by him. There's another chapter about Parks and Rec, which has basically, like, the audiobook chapter basically has like director commentary, as the creator and writer of Parks and Rec is like there with her and interjects his experience and his thoughts on just things that come up in that chapter. In both those cases, before the chapter begins, there's like probably 5 minutes of just like ad-lib, them chatting, and it's funny and it's enjoyable. I really liked it, so I would definitely recommend the audiobook. The second book that I read was Adventures with Waffles by Maria Parr. This I picked up because it had a cute cover and the story inside was just as cute. It is a middle grade book. It's a translated work from Norwegian. This book follows about a year in the life of Trill and his best friend and neighbor Lena, who is a bit of a Anne of Green Gables, Pippi Longstocking character. She's there for the adventure and gets into a lot of mischief. And you follow their adventures over about a year's time, overlapping, getting to know their families as they run through the Norwegian fjords. You get a lot of the feeling for this book being set in Norway, and I really liked that. Another element to this book that I really like is that it's sort of chapter episodal driven in a way that feels very nostalgic of childhood. There is an overarching narrative that I think works really well as well, but you have these little episodes of just adventures these two kids get up to. It was cute, and I didn't have really high expectations, but it really exceeded them. It's also middle grade March, so this is a perfect book to fit that bill if anyone hasn't already established their TBR for that. The third book I read was Beartown by Fredrik Backman. This is also a translated book. Fredrik Backman is Swedish, and it's a book about a town, really. It's about a small, isolated town in Sweden, and this town is obsessed with hockey. The hopes and dreams of this town are placed on their junior hockey team, and in particular the star of their junior hockey team. And this book has a huge cast of characters who follow or are in some way connected to the hockey club, either running the club or the junior team members, or the junior team members' families and teachers and things like that. It's just there's sort of a network along the lines of hockey. The plot of this book really takes off when a violent act is committed against a girl in the story after the junior hockey team's semifinals. The book is really about the way that this town reacts to that. It's about toxic masculinity and misogyny. It's about privilege and minorities and the way that consequences aren't the same for everybody. It's about adolescence and childhood and the communication gaps between parents and children. It has a lot in this book, and it's really about the human experience. If you initially felt off-put by the fact it was about hockey, I care nothing about hockey, and this book really like I really liked this book. I thought that Fredrik Backman handles the subject matter really well. He doesn't give easy answers to really complicated and nuanced issues. I also really appreciated that the huge cast of characters meant that everything had several perspectives to it, and even if there is a right answer to the issue, you got a lot of different perspectives on it that allowed for, I guess, encouraging empathy and understanding. I did come away wondering exactly how the author being male fed into the dynamic of this book, because I don't think that the portrayal of toxic masculinity would have been as well received if this book was written by a female. So I found that really interesting. Anyway, I am excited to read the second in the book in this series, and I gave this one 5 stars. I really enjoyed this book and would not only recommend it, but consider it something that would probably be really good for any person to read. It's really great. I feel like I should mention there is sexual assault content in this book. There's also quite a bit of language or locker talk. It is offensive at times, but serves a purpose to the plot. Ultimately, I felt like it was handled really well, but just so that you're aware. Next, I read Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. This book is quite famous, but before I read it, I didn't really know what it was about, so if you are likewise in the same boat as I was. This book takes place before the end of slavery in the southern United States, and it follows a few slaves. A few of them belong to a family who are fairly kind and generous owners, but unfortunately have to sell their slaves, which becomes a huge source of anxiety for these characters, of course. But especially because you never know what your new owner is going to be like. A few of these characters decide to run away to the north to get to Canada to be free, and others we follow as they're traded eventually farther and farther south, which has a reputation for being more and more brutal. I had a hard time deciding how I felt about it because on the one hand I believe that it was highly praised by Abraham Lincoln and considered to have contributed to the end of slavery and like the beginning of the Civil War and things like that by really encapsulating and presenting in a very empathetic way like the life of slaves to white people and, you know, that perspective. I think that all of those attributes are valuable and to consider, but independently as a book, like just completely a standalone book, if I decontextualize it from culture, I didn't care for it a lot. Like literarily, it was really dry and I didn't feel like the characters were well-rounded. There were like a lot of caricatures, both in the black and white characters. And I think that that served a purpose that was important when you consider the historical context and that it was really informative to the time period in which it was published and that read it immediately after it being published. But as someone that is familiar with the historical context of slavery, it wasn't like an educational work. Like me reading it wasn't exceptionally educational. It was great to, I did feel a lot of empathy and it gave me that experience, but it wasn't like I was enlightened to what the slave experience was like because I was already aware of that and it didn't change my feelings towards it. However, it is hard to decontextualize it from its historical significance as well. I think that that's really important, and it's hard when you start talking about classics to decontextualize them from history anyway. This one is just particular significance because I think it really bumps the value of this book up a lot. I decided to kind of go with the middle ground and I gave it 3 stars. I think that if it had no historical significance, I would have given this book more like 2 stars. But I'm glad that I read it, and it was on my list of books that I'm embarrassed I haven't read yet, which I'm working hard on. As a side note, I hadn't quite decided if I want to put this in my video, but I've shared that I studied art history and people have mentioned me putting a little bit more of that into my channel. I oftentimes compare books to artworks. Like that's just a way that my brain kind of relates to things. In this case with Uncle Tom's Cabin, I actually had a really strong art world association, so I will share it with you just as a fun fact. There is an artwork called the Rockefeller Rothko. It was purchased in the 1950s by David Rockefeller, and it hung in his office as the vice president of Chase Bank. This artwork came up for auction when David Rockefeller decided to sell it in 2007. At the time, the highest price that a Rockefeller had sold for was $22 million. Sotheby's, who was selling the artwork, optimistically decided that this work would probably sell for $40 million, but it actually ended up selling for $72 million. There is an argument that this artwork, if it was not at all associated with one of its owners, would be worth like $22 million. But its value is increased by $50 million because it was owned by David Rockefeller. Do you see the parallel? Like, this book independently was a decent book, but it's like, I think that the praise and remarkability of it and its importance is not irrelevant or unfounded. It's just connected to things outside of the actual book. Which again is not irrelevant, but it's exceptional in a way that is not related to its actual literature, if that makes sense. So there you go. There's your fun art fact for today. So in January, I read the first 2 books in Jojo Moyes series. So I listened to like the first half of Still Me, and I realized that this book is going nowhere. So I DNF'd it. I felt like there was no plot. You were just sort of following along the main character. And in the first book, I liked the main character enough that that would have been fine. But in this one, I was really bored. And unfortunately, like, I literally had to get really bored because it took place in Manhattan, and I love Manhattan. And sometimes, like, just the setting alone will carry the book. It just, like, I lived there for a little while, and it makes me nostalgic for it. So you know, this book really had to fall flat for me to get rid of it anyway. So the next book I read was The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. This was also on my list of books that I'm embarrassed I haven't read yet for 2019. The storyline, if you're not familiar, this is a children's classic, is about a girl whose parents die and she is sent away to live with her uncle, where there is allegedly a secret garden that his wife cared for, but she has passed away, and eventually she makes friends with a few people there and discovers this garden and takes care of it. This was a sweet, very heartwarming story and took me by surprise by how much I enjoyed it. I thought that it would be maybe too sugary sweet or just kind of stuffy, I'm not sure, but it had a really good pace for a classic. I felt like it moved along really well. It's not too long. And I actually was left really wishing that I had read this as a child, and it's definitely on my list of books that I'm gonna make sure I read to my kids. I think it has great themes about like how your thoughts have tangible consequences, either for those around you or on your own physical health, or just how your attitude and your perspective on the world actually has a significant difference. And I loved that. I really liked this book, and I liked the characters. I think if I had met them in real life, I would have not cared for the children because they're kind of snobby, but in the book, I enjoyed them. So anyway, yeah, if you haven't read it before, it's really short, and I'm really glad I read it. I thought it was great. I think I gave it 5 stars. I gave it 4 stars. I can't remember why I gave it 4 stars though. Maybe I should give it 5 stars. It was great. Anyway, the next book I read was The 4-Hour Workweek by Timothy Ferris. This is a book about how to streamline and automize and outsource your work in order to have more time to yourself and to work less hours a week. When I started the book, I was really inspired and loved all of his ideas. After about halfway through, I started to feel like it was really repetitive and there wasn't anything new that he was offering. And there were a few points in the book where I felt like this was really oversimplified. and not as helpful. In all, I think the book just could have been cut down a lot. Another issue I found with the book was also that there were tons of references to websites or resources in that respect that really dated the book and made me think like there are better programs to use than the one that he mentioned. Or there's a time where like Skype is explained, like he gives like a definition of what Skype is, and I was like, wow, that just really dated the book right now. For the most part, I found this really interesting. I work remotely and love that it enables me to travel, and it was kind of the way that I grew up. Both my parents were entrepreneurs and we lived abroad several times, so like the work-life balance and having flexible work is something that I'm familiar with, and I enjoyed that this book was really kind of about that. I wouldn't necessarily give it like a blanket recommendation though, because this book is for entrepreneurs and business people and people whose work who could become remote. I don't feel like he was clear in the book that the template he's offering is not universally going to work for everybody. I also, by the end, started feeling slightly uncomfortable because a lot of his ideas of how to work were slightly exploitative. I don't think it's a problem if you're an entrepreneur and you're running your own business, but the recommendations for people who were not business owners was essentially, you know, if you're on salary, to start getting your boss to let you work remotely, and then once you're remote, you start streamlining and making all of your work more efficient and outsourcing some of it to assistants in the Philippines. I understand his argument behind this, but it also feels a little bit dishonest. I don't know exactly how I feel about it, but I think it depends on how it's approached, but it feels like there's a lot of room for kind of exploiting the system. That's just my personal feelings on it. The next book I read was Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. This is another book that was on my list of books I'm embarrassed I haven't read yet, list to read in 2019, and I'm glad that I got around to reading it. However, I was very disappointed and really surprised to find that I hated it. It is generally a fairly liked book, so if you disagree with me on this matter, that's completely fine. On the one hand, I can understand how it is significant as one of the first books of like first dystopian books, and it was exploring really new philosophical ideas. Like, that makes a lot of sense to me. But the actual reading of the book was so dry. Like, the characters were so boring. The plot was so boring, if existent at all. And the philosophy, like, I am all for social critique and, you know, engaging with a book intellectually, but this was like getting hit over the head with a hammer in terms of, you know, the author's philosophy. It was not subtle, it was not intellectually engaging. I didn't find it. It was really, really boring. Again, historically, I can understand that in the time that it was written, it would have been quite significant for its novelty, but I found it really boring. I DNF'd it at like 2/3 of the way through. I really expected to enjoy it. I will say that I have a little bit of a hard time with dystopian novels because I think that there's, you know, if it's not adequately primed to understand why the characters think and behave in the way that they do within the context of their world, I end up just finding it really hard to relate to characters that are just so essentially brainwashed. I understand that it's like a different world and that's kind of the point, but if there's not enough like priming to set up how these people have been conditioned to behave so unnaturally to like human instinct, it just is really disengaging to me. Anyway, I'm sure this is an unpopular opinion, and if you really disagree with me, share with me like what you liked about this book, because are very few people that gave this 1 star on Goodreads, and I gave it 1 star. Anyway, yeah, I gave it 1 star. Sorry for any of you that love that book. The last book I read was The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams. Which was also on my list of books I'm embarrassed I haven't read yet for 2019. I'm doing amazing at this list. I think I've already read 5 books off of it. I'm so proud of myself. It was hilarious. Like, I really thought this book was so funny. The humor was just absolutely fantastic. I laughed out loud many, many times. The story is about a man here on Earth whose friend tells him that he is an alien and that the Earth is going to blow up, make way for like a, I can't remember the name for it, but it's like a galaxy highway. Basically the Earth is just in the way, and so his friend takes him off of Earth and they're hitchhiking through the galaxy essentially while his friend is contributing to a book called The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I liked the science fiction element of it. I really liked it. I think I gave it 4 stars. It maybe deserves 5 stars, but I'm not in the camp of people who think it's like the best book ever. I know there's like a cult following around this book in a way, but like I did think it was really, really great. I think it was a great introduction to science fiction for me, and I would like to give the genre a bit more of a chance and, you know, take some effort to read a few more science fiction books. That's it for the books I read in February. Thank you for watching. If you had thoughts on any of these books that I read, then let me know down below. I've also linked down below my Instagram, which I have forgotten to say in like every video so far. I've linked that down below if you want to follow me there. I'm working on posting more often. Like, I would like to engage in that community more and be able to communicate with you guys there. I'm sorry I've been really bad on answering comments lately as well. Just been busy. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in a future video. Bye!